Good afternoon, Amy, and thank you very much for joining us to talk to the Mint magazine today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Brilliant. Well, I absolutely loved your book, and totally gripping. I read it so fast that it's now some time ago, but I remember it. I still remember it enough. But I thought we'd sort of follow the structure, and I loved your term, giving became shopping. Uh, uh, Tell me what did you mean by that, and what's wrong with it?
So I'll give you a very recent story. And actually, this story is also the story of how my agent found me, just as a side note to behind the scenes of the book. Um, in 2020, the US had this massive uprising of protests against police brutality and against racial injustice. This is in the summer of 2020, and one of the things that happened it was a massive groundswell of fundraising for bail funds. So in the United States, you have to have cash bail, and bail funds are organizations that simply raise money to just unconditionally pay bail to free people from the sort of limbo in the justice system that can actually be quite deadly. So one of those bail funds raised $30 million because they were visible. They got a lot of traction on social media. They were also from Minnesota, and George Floyd, whose murder catalyzed these uprisings, happened in Minneapolis. So, okay, for a lot of reasons, they just raised an absolutely huge, vast sum of money. And uh, in within a couple of months, this very small volunteer-run nonprofit announced that they had done something that was quite powerful for them, which was pay bail of all the people who'd been arrested for protesting. But that amount that they had paid out was a small fraction of what they had raised. And so this brings us to the shopping piece of this. The response on social media and some of the, I would say, like bad faith coverage from more reactionary sources basically said, like, um, we want to see the receipts of what's coming in and what's going out. We want to see these transactions more documented. We like, what are you doing with the rest of the money that we gave you? We want to see results. We want to know that it's being put to use. Now, I would just sort of pause and say there are times where that critique is completely valid, but what's interesting about it is the language that even very seemingly like radical people, radically progressive people adopted that positioned them as essentially consumers who had a right to um, purchase an outcome, like that their gifts were going to purchase an outcome in so it like socially, and that they wanted a receipt for that felt very telling about the sort of consumer mentality.
Yeah.
Now, how my agent found me is I had a long Twitter thread about this, and then that's how he started following me on Twitter. That's just a sidebar. Um, but the that is just one story of a trend that goes back several years, where it's no longer giving as a kind of surrender of funds to be sort of aggregated into a larger effort. It is a donor in a sort of sovereign manner, trying to purchase an outcome, right? There's both the kind of abstract way that this happens, where it's a sense of like, I want to purchase an outcome. I want my money. I want to know that my money is generating some kind of identifiable impact, which is sort of like the product that that donor is getting. There's also the very practical ways that this has gotten conflated, where giving your charitable donations has become incorporated into consumer purchases. So I'm thinking about cause branded merchandise, Red, which would raise money for AIDS research, um, or Tom's shoes. These are all examples that I cover in the book. But to the sense of like conflating the sense of control that a consumer has, the sense of discretion, the sense of choice, and also about kind of a concrete identifiable product that they're purchasing. That became conflated with the act of charitable giving, which I think has been quite harmful, because charitable giving is meant to be about releasing control, right? Releasing a sense of like these are funds that I'm surrendering in some way to something bigger than myself. And when giving becomes shopping, it's the both the practical and the abstract ways in which giving just becomes an extension of the kind of the sovereignty that a consumer has.
And a sort of self-gratification.
Yes, self-gratification is absolutely right.
Would you include? I remember, giving people goats, but and sponsoring children. I suppose that is the more
Yes,
specific, if you like. That's my child now, and
right. Yes, it's that kind of one-to-one relationship of like this is the money that I'm giving, this is the good that it's purchasing. Some sense of like I need to have that concreteness. Um, and I think actually more than that, it's the adoption of the vocabulary of shopping. So the idea, it's not just, oh, I'm purchasing some sort of concrete um, good or service, but that I'm looking, there's an example in the book of a Canadian organization that organizes this as a catalog, right? You get to browse the catalog of like what charitable donation you're going to give. Now, of course, all of these are just marketing devices. They're marketing devices that are meant to package what is ultimately like a $25, $100, it's all going into the general pot. But these are all devices to give people the impression that they are buying something concrete, buying something tangible with their giving, and giving them the sense of deference and control that they have when they're consumers who are choosing what sweater to buy.
and that is, I suppose, compared to like providing a regular donation to Oxfam or something like that, because you think, well, that's a good organisation, seems to be good things. I'll contribute to its broad purpose. So what's wrong with that? I mean, the money gets out there, good presumably happens. Why should we worry about that?
To me, it's the erosion of a mentality, a way of engaging with money and the world that allows us to think about money differently than we do in our normal sort of commercially saturated lives. So if we were speaking um, to a certain, to academics, or if we were talking to very politically engaged people, I would say it's just part of the neoliberal brainworms, that sort of take over, that give you a sense of like all of life is reducible to a commercial transaction, to a cost benefit analysis, to a sovereign individual maximizing their impact, maximizing their power, and the power of their money sort of reflected in the discretion of what they choose. So it really is just about like, is charitable giving facilitating the takeover of that way of thinking, or could it be a source of resistance where we say, even the staunchest capitalist can say, there is a realm of my life where different norms are in play in terms of my relationship to money, where I give because I want to be part of something bigger than myself. I give because I'm obligated to be part of a community. I give because I think this is just an important thing that I want everyone to be able to experience. Of course, this isn't to suggest that exists in such a pure form. It's just that there's a notably different way of dealing with giving where you're not supposed to get something in return than there is with shopping, where the whole idea is that you are exchanging money for something very specific in return. And once those become conflated, it feels like what gets sacrificed is um, the norms of giving that really have to do with not emphasizing individual power, that have to do with emphasizing being part of something larger, being part of giving some sense of deference to others.
And so, is then effective altruism like the same thing for mega rich people, or it's a sort of writ large and made technical, etc.? Then we work out exactly what's going to work and get our, is that really is that it?
So I think it is. I think that's absolutely right. And effective altruism. So in the book, that's the chapter 3, and it comes after 2 chapters that have sort of established the history of how we've gotten to this approach to giving. So it begins with St. Augustine sermons about giving as basically investments that pay off in the form of salvation.
Right.
So that sense of like giving is not just, you don't give gifts, you invest in a way that reflects your own self-interest in some way, right?
You're buying a
So
stairway to heaven.
you're exactly, you're buying a stairway to heaven. He has a phrase where he talks about poor people transporting their good deeds to heaven, presumably on that staircase, but maybe in the service entrance. Um,
Yeah.
so that's where we begin, and so the whole first third of the book is meant to sort of walk from how do we get from St. Augustine to Sam Bankman-Fried.
Yeah.
To me, the common thread is this really is about seeing giving as a way of maximizing utility for the donor, maximizing some form of benefit for the donor. And I know that that might seem counterintuitive, but if you begin with the sense of like what I'm buying is salvation, what you end up with ineffective altruism is I'm buying some sense of um, self-satisfaction, confirmation of my own um, brilliance, right? My own wisdom of like knowing where this goes as a validation of my virtue, my like the justification of my wealth. You're kind of buying this self confirmation. It's almost like who needs salvation in the afterlife when you have so much validation in the moral realm. So yes, effective altruism very much is the extreme sort of culmination of this utilitarian and very self-gratifying way of approaching giving.
And you trace this back to St. Augustine, but would you say that this sort of extreme effective altruism is a recent trend, and where does it come from, or has it been? Is it just it's been there all the time? It's just we haven't really noticed it so much.
Okay, right. So effective altruism, as we know it, is about 10 years old, but it is only sort of the latest iteration of an approach to giving that dates back, I'm going to say at this point, 20 to 30 years, that um, sought to make giving more, it really sought to apply like the standards of quantification to giving. So with in the very early, in the late 90s, this was called venture philanthropy. How can we make philanthropy more like a business? How can
Right.
we make nonprofits run more like businesses? This sort of goes back to the earlier point about giving and shopping, which is like, how can we make not earning money more like earning money? It's sort of a
Right.
like ridiculous paradox in there that sort of speaks to a lack of imagination of like, how can we make this thing that isn't really capitalist at all more like capitalism? How can we make it conform more to our sort of capitalist norms of like self-sufficiency and generating profit? Never mind the fact that like the whole point of giving is that there's realms of life that are not sustainable commercially, but that's uncomfortable, I think, increasingly uncomfortable for people to accept. So you early on you get venture philanthropy, which then sort of morphs into philanthrocapitalism. Um, that was sort of in the mid 2000s, I want to say. And so these are all kind of different names and slightly more extreme and distilled versions of the same thinking. And what the effective altruists have is the kind of single-minded, like algorithmic fetishization, right? Of like, oh well, we can just. It's so easy for us to calculate because once we get all of this data and all of these numbers, then the answers reveal themselves. You just have like an even more extreme expression of that, but it has been building for some time.
So I wonder, is that an indication of, I suppose, total power and conquering everything, or is that maybe a sense of vulnerability, or you're afraid that if other realities exist, that somehow threatens your reality? Or, I mean, was it a bit of both?
I think that you're right, but I don't think they know it. Um, you know,
Right.
in a sense, like I'm sure that you're right that there is some need to reinforce one's worldview against, the intrusion of other realities. Of course, that's so. Um, but I think that knowing what I know of the milieu of effective altruism, I think that these are people whose intelligence has been praised and validated, and who have such a high opinion of themselves and their tools, whose hubris leads them into massive scandal. You can just see how like insulated they are from any level of introspection. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily give credit to them somehow having some conscious psychological reckoning of, perhaps we're the baddies after all. I just don't think that's the case knowing the personalities here. And I'm not just talking about Sam Bankman-Fried. I'm talking about, the scandals about Nick Bostrom and his like racist remarks on a web forum several years ago. I'm talking about scandals around sexual harassment that were covered in the United States. There's just I think it's rampant, the hubris, the sense of like of omnipotence, and I think that's pretty much the appeal.
So we've been through all the things that are, that are wrong.
Right.
Um, so what's the alternative? Assuming that there is always, I suppose you'd say, there's always going to be some people wealthier than others, even if you think inequality is a bad thing. But assuming philanthropy is a phenomenon of, is always going to be with us, like the death and taxes, I guess. Uh, um, how do you think it could work and actually be positive?
Well, I want to clarify one thing, which is to say, my critique of utilitarianism and effective altruism exists alongside, but separate from my concerns about wealth inequality. Because I think it's important to keep in mind that um, some of the examples that I use in the book to really celebrate and uplift positive examples of philanthropy are people who were or are extremely wealthy. And so my concern is, though I have severe concerns about the scope of economic inequality that exists today, I'm not biased against inequality per se, like just as a kind of social phenomenon. And in fact, there is something to be said for the kinds of risks and the kinds of examples that people who are free from market pressure can set, in terms of how we use funding. Now, so all of which is to say, it's less about, um, rich people are bad, overall, and more about the fact that some examples that we have of wealthy people show us how to do philanthropy in a way that affirms humanity. And however, the examples that we have today primarily, are ones that really dehumanize others. So it's really more a question of sensibility, than it is, like a sort of flat rejection of inequality. It's like, how do we use inequality to best advantage? But to answer your original question, so the examples that I have at the close of the book, some are really big philanthropists and some are small dollar, right? There are some grassroots campaigns that I'm really excited by, in the book. And sometimes it's the two working together. But overall, it really is about creating places and spaces, um, that nurture our most human qualities, that sort of nurture things that can't be commodified on the market, at least not wholly. Our sense of imagination, our sense of connection, our sort of cultivation of curiosity. So one example of these spaces was, Hull House, which was a settlement house in Chicago at the turn of the 19th century with Jane Addams, which really affirmed that the people who were living in the nearby slums deserved places of learning and culture and community and recreation. And this extends to the work that LeBron James does in Akron, where at his school, it's not just about, I want these kids to get better test scores. It's, I want these kids to have bikes and helmets and have this sense of freedom and play in their lives, right? Things that are not going to show up in any quantifiable metric, but are very important to people's full realization as human beings. And then the sort of smaller examples are, you know, the fundraising that happens for community gardens and the land trust and or protects community gardens in the U.S., specifically New York City. The story of how the Statue of Liberty was installed with the help of small dollar giving. So it doesn't have to be large, but my belief is that philanthropy really should not be about things that can be measured quantifiably. It should be about these kind of core qualities that their value is that they can't be measured. They're really about they're about flourishing as human beings. And so the more you can support spaces of gathering with no commercial purpose, of art and culture, of recreation and leisure, and make them accessible for everyone, ideally free, that's what philanthropy can uniquely do that's of value.
That's very interesting because I mean, I suppose to be devil's advocate, people say, well, yeah, that's all very middle class, isn't it?
I think you mean that in the British sense.
Yes,
So
I mean that in the British sense that,
yes.
opera, well, or high art or culture. I mean, that's where the middle classes, the rich people go and ponce around in their suit, their tails and their suits and feel good about themselves.
Well, that is the cynical way of looking at it, but I don't think that's right because um, that becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy at a certain point that says, oh, poor people don't care about, or even, working class people don't care about the opera or about, any of these sort of higher goods in life. And I just don't think that's true. And in fact, I think Jane Addams very specifically said, like, this is how we affirm people's humanity in the age of industrialization, where like that to say there's some sort of um, elitist barrier to this suggests that poor people are only are only concerned with their own survival and have no other interests or passions or abilities that they want to cultivate, and that's just not true. And in fact, that would mean that we are now dehumanizing rather than affirming their humanity.
And I suppose this is also reaffirming humanity in the face of artificial intelligence.
Absolutely, it is. Absolutely. I mean, what's more, um, artificial intelligence really is attempting, I think, to reduce humanity to its quantifiable outputs, right? To its sort of, and its predictable outputs, I would say. And um, the whole idea is that we can, human beings, this is from Hannah Arendt, who's one of my founding philosophers in my doctoral work and to some extent in the book. But really, what makes us human is that we can create new things, that we can imagine new possibilities, um, that we are unpredictable, that there's like change and evolution possible. Not that we follow increasingly predictable patterns as sort of identified by an algorithm, but that we are so much more complex and fluid than that.
So, how do you think your potential clients, because you are a consultant, aren't you, on philanthropy? How are your clients going to take this? I mean, are they going to kick you out and say you are, totally against everything that we all believe in? Are there any strands of people or groups that will say, wow, great, that needs saying?
Well, I think there are a few strands of possibility. And one is that there's increasingly a backlash to the the kind of again, this goes by many, many names, but quantification driven philanthropy, a sense of like, I think many grant makers are realizing, oh, our desire for proof, our desire for our own, which is again part of that kind of self-centeredness, self-gratification, our desire for proof that we were the best ones, we gave the best money, that did the best thing, that's onerous for our grantees. So there's something, I think there is a sort of slow attenuation that script that says like, oh, we want proof. I think people are seeing that like that actually is counterproductive to giving. So for one thing, I think if it interrupts that assumption in any way, that'll be great. Um, I think that the most likely scenario, if I'm being honest, is um, a client, either a nonprofit or a foundation or a wealthy individual, might read my book and say, "This is very interesting. I'd like to talk to you about it. Wow, what you had to say is so brilliant and so wonderful." And then they'll go back to doing things exactly as they did. I don't have any expectations that I'm necessarily, I think this will be a very interesting thought exercise for many, if we're honest. And then I think that there are some who will say, you know what, like there might be very few, but I do think there will be a few who say, oh, like I get it. We're supposed to be not kind of intensifying the alienation and the sort of fragmentation of humanity in the age of AI and neoliberalism. We're supposed to be doing these like small, local, very connecting things that affirm humanity. I'd like to believe that there are some who are really for whom it's going to be a real paradigm shift. But again, realistically, I think they will nod politely. And
it's fascinating because I think, as I sort of understand it, this is a lot about this giving away power, isn't it? And
it is.
And people who have spent their lives accumulating power, to give away power, it's quite a big thing, isn't it?
I agree. I think that's right and quite astute. Which is why I think that they will. I don't trust that many people will be able to adopt this strategy because it is so difficult.
Yeah.
I hope that it causes people to be more introspective and more reflective. Like, is this an extension of my feeling of power or my need for control or my need for validation? I hope it engenders that level of questioning. I think that would be a wonderful and most worthy outcome.
Because it's interesting. I mean, in my experience of dealing with philanthropic trusts and so forth, trying to get money, I sort of look at the people on the boards, and they all seem to be the sort of offspring or whatever of who, presumably are getting validation from making decisions and feel, etc., for being on this board. And if you told them, well, just give the money away, just have a look. If you like what they're doing, just give them money. It's like, well, what do I do? I mean, what's my role? That doesn't give me much
Right.
feel good about.
Right. Yes, there's a lot of things bundled together when people are in philanthropy, and it's a Trojan horse, right? Where I'm giving you this money, but what we've tacitly exchanged is actually like exactly what you say. Like I'm giving away this money, and I can never say what I really want is for my wisdom and intellect and virtue to be validated. But of course, everyone understands that those are the terms of what's happening. So it will be interesting of like what happens if you're able to successfully interrupt that, or at least shed light. If I'm able to shed light on that circuit, of that sort of that exchange, then I think most people might be able to sort of look at it and partially absorb it, and then quickly retract. But some will say, "Oh, this is really causing me to reflect." And I should also say, to answer your question, like I think there are some people who will reject my book out of hand and say, "How can you validate anything about philanthropy?" Right? This is just a product of a vastly unjust, capitalist system. So, I'm prepared for a lot of critique and rejection, basically from all sides.
Well, at least you prepared yourself for that. I mean, I think there's one angle I've noticed is that some of these philanthropic trusts, talk about trying to create system change.
Yeah.
And yet, if they still then say, I want this and that done, of course, system change is an uncertain, it requires innovation, requires trying various, et cetera, et cetera. And I think maybe they're beginning to get the idea that being too prescriptive of what you ask, well, it's not going to change anything because it'll be, very narrow and siloed and particular. And
that's right. That would be absolute. I think that's spot on, and that's certainly one of my hopes that, like, if it changes any practices, that would be one of them. That kind of mismatch of ambition and operations would somehow resolve itself more smoothly, and people would say, "Oh, okay, perhaps if I'm trying to do this, I need to actually change the way, really take seriously the amount of power that I have, and how can I kind of pull that back." I think that would be great. The other thing I will say is, and this came up in the book, there is a funder in the United States, although I'm sure she has a profile in the UK as well, Mackenzie Scott, who's the ex-wife of Jeff Bezos, who's been giving away money at an incredibly record-setting rate. And she too, writes about her understanding of systemic racism, sexism, other forms of oppression. And my view of that is that if you want those things, trying to achieve them through nonprofits is not the way to go. That there are much more, radical ways, for better or worse, right? This isn't to say, like, everyone should give to political campaigns. I don't think that's the healthiest thing about American democracy. However, in this case, it's just to say, like, listen, if you happen to have a few $1 billion at your disposal and you really want to change, systemic oppression, then you should be using it to change regulations around labor rights or around, financial services, or, like, there are structural things that you can do that are further upstream in the political economy than the nonprofits that are just sort of at the tail end of its effects.
Well, that is a whole, other sort of dimension, isn't it? But whatever, I wish you the best luck in changing the philanthropic system anyway. And I suppose some NGOs will be fighting to change policy and regulation as well. So maybe it fits together. But it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. And
likewise.
Thank you very much for your time. And I look forward to hopefully meeting you on your book tour.
I would love that. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks very much.